In 1943, the United States Army Air Corps took over the Malaha Army Airfield from the British, who had captured it from the Germans earlier that year. The Americans renamed the field Wheelus Army Airfield and used it for the next 27 years in a variety of ways. At one time, it was the largest U.S. military facility outside the U.S., with over 15,000 personnel and their dependents based there. By the late 1960s, America's defense priorities had shifted to the degree that keeping Wheelus Air Base open didn't make fiscal sense. So the Nixon administration reached an agreement to hand it over to Libya's King Idris. But before the United States could withdraw, Idris was overthrown by a group of Arab nationalists led by a young revolutionary named Muammar Gaddafi. The coup, however, had little effect on the U.S. exit, and they handed the base over to the new government in June of 1970. It didn't take long for Gaddafi to turn Libya from a Western ally to an enemy, particularly to the United States that he claimed to despise because of its support for Israel. In the first decade and a half after seizing power, Gaddafi nationalized the oil industry and used the revenue to grow the size of his military. And much to the Americans' concern, the Soviet Union was more than happy to sell him weapons. He also sponsored terrorist training camps within Libya and supplied funds, weapons, and logistical support for numerous groups, including that headed by the notorious Abu Nidal. By the early 1980s, the number of terrorist attacks had grown tenfold worldwide on Gaddafi's watch. Along the way, Gaddafi added to his international provocations by declaring the Gulf of Sidra south of the line of latitude at 32 degrees 30 minutes north as domestic waters, in spite of the fact that the claim was in violation of international admiralty law. President Ronald Reagan, who had repeatedly criticized his predecessor Jimmy Carter during the campaign for being soft on terror, ordered the U.S. Navy to maintain station in the region and to consistently operate south of Gaddafi's so-called line of death, what the Americans called freedom of navigation, or FONOPS. In response to FONOPS, Gaddafi would respond with fighters and patrol boats, and on August 19, 1981, the lead aircraft of a flight of two Libyan Su-22 fitters fired on two VF-41 F-14As flying combat air patrol off of the USS Nimitz. That action met the definition of a hostile act in accordance with the Sixth Fleet rules of engagement at the time, and the Tomcats wound up shooting down both of the Libyan fitters. But that shootdown only increased Gaddafi's support of global terror. In response, President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 138, which laid out a U.S. policy of both preemptive and retaliatory strikes against terrorists across the globe. But the mere existence of that directive had no deterrent effect, and in November of 1985, Abu Nidal's men hijacked an Egypt Air flight, and 60 passengers wound up getting killed during the rescue attempt by Egyptian commandos. Then on December 27, 1985, Nidal's operatives launched simultaneous attacks on the major airports in Rome and Vienna, which resulted in the deaths of 20 passengers and 4 terrorists. At the same time, the U.S. got intel that the Libyans had taken delivery of SA-5 long-range surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet Union. In response, President Reagan ordered the U.S. Navy to ramp up FONOPS, so the Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, asked the Chief of Naval Operations to send a third carrier battle group to the Mediterranean, and the USS America joined USS Saratoga and USS Coral Sea, already in the Sixth Fleet area of responsibility. In addition to the 3 aircraft carriers and 225 aircraft in the attached air wings, the Armada had 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 frigates, and 4 replenishment ships. The 3 carriers split the FONOPS coverage, labeled Operation Prairie Fire, with America's air wing flying from midnight until noon, Saratoga's wing from noon until midnight, and Coral Sea's wing flying from 0530 to 1830 because the Libyans didn't seem to fly at night. This coverage started on the 23rd of March, 1986. On the morning of the 24th of March, the Libyans shot 2 SA-5s at a section of VF-102 Tomcats, but the SAMs failed to guide. That afternoon, 2 more SA-5s were fired at a pair of VF-33 Tomcats. Those missiles were jammed by one of the Air Wing EA-6B Prowlers nearby. Then the real action began. 2 hours later, 2 MiG-25 Foxbats took off from Benina Air Base with orders to intercept and shoot down some of the U.S. fighters. The Foxbats were picked up by the E-2C Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and 2 VF-33 Tomcats were given a hot vector. The Starfighter F-14s merged with the MiGs, and a fairly aggressive dogfight ensued. The F-14 flight lead transmitted that the MiGs were demonstrating excessive hostile actions and intentions, and the air warfare commander aboard the USS Saratoga replied with, "Warning yellow, weapons hold," which meant the Tomcats could shoot if necessary. As this television camera system footage shows, the F-14s wound up behind the Foxbats and got good Sidewinder tones, but the crews weren't sure if they met the ROE, and before they could confirm permission to fire, the MiG-25s did what MiG-25s do best and hauled ass back south at Mach 2.5. Meanwhile, several Libyan patrol boats put to sea north towards the U.S. battle groups, and the E-2 vectored some of Saratoga's A-7s and A-6s to watch it overhead. When one of the airplanes got lit up by a patrol boat's fire control radar, the USS Richmond K. Turner, a Leahy-class destroyer, launched a Harpoon missile, which struck the Libyan vessel and set it ablaze. It was eventually towed back to Benghazi. In response to that patrol boat's aggressive posture, all three carriers launched strike packages using their full complement of fighter, strike, and electronic warfare aircraft, including the relatively new FA-18s based aboard Coral Sea. The first air attack happened at around 1926 local time when two VA-34 intruders found Wahid, a French-built La Compétente patrol boat. Wahid was first disabled by a Harpoon missile and then destroyed by Rockeye cluster bombs dropped by intruders from VA-85, the other A-6 squadron in that air wing. 40 minutes later, Tomcats, Hornets, A-7s, and Prowlers headed towards the SA-5 site near Sirte at low level and suddenly climbed, which caused the Libyans to activate their radars and launch missiles at the incoming aircraft. Basically, the Libyans took the bait, and the A-7s launched several HARM missiles, one of which hit the SA-5 site's tracking radar. An hour later, two of America's intruders used Harpoon missiles to take out an Anuchka-class corvette that was heading towards the USS Yorktown. At the same time, Yorktown fired two Harpoon missiles at another Le Combatant, disabling it. At 0730 the next morning, another Libyan Anuchka-class corvette was taken out with Rockeye, dropped by A-6s from VA-55. After that, Operation Prairie Fire was terminated. The Americans had no casualty or losses of any kind. The Libyans lost 35 sailors and at least 3 combatant ships. But again, Muammar Gaddafi remained undeterred. On April 2nd, explosives detonated aboard a TWA flight bound for Athens, killing 4 Americans. Although a caller in Beirut claimed the bombing constituted a response to the recent U.S. Navy's actions against Libya, the few physical traces of the bombing pointed to involvement by Syria, not Libya. However, Gaddafi praised the terrorists as freedom fighters and vowed to escalate the violence against U.S. targets throughout the world. Then, in the early hours of April 5th, in Berlin, a large bomb gutted La Belle Club, a discotheque popular with U.S. servicemen. The explosion immediately killed an American infantryman and his girlfriend and injured over 200 others, including more than 75 Americans. This time, electronic surveillance intercepted 2 messages to Gaddafi from the East Berlin Libyan's People's Bureau that definitely linked Gaddafi to the bombing. A few hours prior to the detonation, the People's Bureau had told Gaddafi that something being planned would, quote, make him happy, end quote. Following the bombing, they sent notification in general terms stating the precise time of the discotheque explosion. President Reagan now had the evidence he needed to put Directive 138 into action. On April 9th, he authorized a nighttime surgical airstrike against 5 Libyan targets, codenamed Operation El Dorado Canyon. The targets were as follows. 1. The Bab al-Azizia barracks in Tripoli, which Gaddafi used as a command and control center. 2. The Sidi Bilal training camp in Tripoli used for naval special operators. 3. Matiga International Airport, ironically the former Wheelus Air Force Base, which is where the Libyan Air Force based their IL-76 transports. 4. The Jamahiriya Guard Barracks in Benghazi, which was used as Gaddafi's secondary command and control center. And 5. Benina International Airport, which the Libyan Air Force used as the base for their MiG-23s and MiG-25s. As the White House tasking for El Dorado Canyon hit the Pentagon, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman insisted it should be a Navy-only operation. After all, carrier battle groups had been on station continuously for over 5 years, pushing south of Gaddafi's line of death and neutralizing whatever Libyan assets presented themselves. And although the carrier Saratoga had headed home since Operation Prairie Fire, Coral Sea in America possessed more than enough power projection capability to hit the 5 targets while suppressing the enemy's air defenses with jammers and harm shooters and defending against any fighter threat with Tomcats flying combat air patrol. We've got it, Lehman said. This is what we do. Acting Secretary of the Air Force Edward Aldridge, who had just replaced Russell Rourke, who left suddenly for what he called personal reasons, attempted to convince Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger that the Air Force should play a prominent role, if not the lead role, in Operation El Dorado Canyon. And he had a trump card up his sleeve to prove his point. 30 F-117 Nighthawk stealth aircraft sitting on the ramp at Tonopah Test Range in Nevada ready to go. The only question from Vice Admiral Frank Kelso, the 6th Fleet commander and overall lead for the operation, was, what's an F-117? In April of 1986, nobody beyond those involved with the program itself knew of the existence of this revolutionary airplane. Secretary of Defense Weinberger wasn't comfortable with the potential compromise of this still blackest of black programs, so he scrubbed the Air Force's plan to use the Nighthawk, and the stealth fighter would remain in the shadows for a few more years. But Acting Secretary Aldridge wasn't done petitioning the Secretary of Defense that the Air Force should be part of El Dorado Canyon. He cited Operation Ghost Rider, a secret training mission flown the previous year by 10 F-111Es that launched out of England and flew a long-range strike against practice targets near Goose Bay, Canada. Each one of the aardvarks involved had been loaded with 8 inert Mark 82s, and all but one of the bombs hit their targets. All 10 aircraft, along with an equal number of strategic tankers that refueled the bombers continuously during the mission, made it back and forth without incident. Aldridge insisted that the operation was custom-made for the capabilities of the F-111, that was designed to come in low and fast below radar coverage, and that further, the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing currently stationed at Lakenheath Air Force Base in England had the newer F model, which was even better. The 48th also had EF-111 Ravens, which could jam the Libyan radars during the aardvark attack profiles. Secretary Weinberger was convinced, and the Air Force was added to El Dorado Canyon. Meanwhile, on the international negotiations side of the equation, Vernon Walters, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, discussed support for a raid against Libya. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of Great Britain, gave permission for the U.S. Air Force to launch its portion of the raid from British bases, which the Americans figured was never going to be an issue anyway, but the always complicated relationship with the governments of France and Spain continued to be so as those countries denied permission for overflight, which doubled the Air Force's round trip to almost 6,000 miles and now made it more than an 11-hour mission. But the Air Force pressed on undeterred, and the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing mission planners circled up with the strike leads from the 2 carrier air wings at 6th Fleet headquarters in Gaeta, Italy. The targets were divided as follows. F-111s would hit the Bab al-Azizia barracks, the Sidi Bilal Commando Training Camp, and Matiga International Airport in Tripoli. A-6s from USS America would hit Jamahiriya, and A-6s from Coral Sea would take out Benina. Jamming would be coordinated between Navy EA-6B Prowlers and Air Force EF-111 Ravens, and real-time hard killing of enemy SAM sites would be accomplished by Navy A-7s and Hornets carrying AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, better known as HARMs. Coordination of all the moving parts and the time-distance equations was challenging, to put it mildly. America was already on station, but Coral Sea had to do a high-speed transit from Naples through the Strait of Messina, which it did on the 14th of April. Meanwhile, at 1900 local, 28 KC-10 and KC-135 heavy tankers took off from RAF Mendenhall and RAF Fairford, followed shortly by 27 F-111Fs out of RAF Lakenheath and 5 EF-111s out of RAF Upper Hayford. All land and sea operations were performed MCON, no systems emissions or radio communications, including Coral Sea's transit, which had the effect of shaking the Soviet intel ships that always tried to tail American aircraft carriers in the Med. The Air Force assets, 57 aircraft at the outset, proceeded on their Great Circle route around the tip of Europe with their anti-collision lights and identification friend or foe, IFF gear, turned off. Once the first of more than a dozen in-flight refuelings was successfully completed, 6 of the F-111s and 1 EF-111, the designated spares, turned back for home base in England. The rest of the crews steeled themselves for the long flight ahead. At approximately 0100 on the 15th of April, as the Air Force package transited the Strait of Gibraltar, the 2 carrier air wing packages launched off of their respective flight decks. To the U.S. Navy's pleasant surprise, the Air Force package arrived right on time. After the final pre-strike Air Force refueling was complete, 4 Tomcats joined their assigned F-111s as attached combat air patrol. At that point, only 18 F-111s remained, as 1 couldn't tank in time to make the push to the target, and 2 others had systems malfunctions that forced them to abort the mission. Coordinated jamming from the north by the EF-111s and the EA-6Bs began at 0154, as the A-7s and F-18s launched anti-radiation missiles to hard-kill 16 of the Libyan SAM sites as they attempted to target the American aircraft. The harm shooters followed that with the shorter-range anti-radiation Shrike missiles and took out 6 more sites, just as the F-111s were flying into range of the SAMs. At that point, the aardvarks had descended to 200 feet over the water, flying transonic on a southeasterly heading towards their targets. The first F-111 launched a GBU-10 at 0200 hours, and it hit Gaddafi's barracks at Bab al-Azizia. But of the 9 F-111s in that element, only 3 of their bombs hit their targets. Some of the aircraft had systems failures in the endgame. Some of the weapons systems officers lost their laser picture as the pilots maneuvered to avoid SAMs. And in one case, because the target was obscured by smoke, one of the bombs hit a civilian home, which was the one thing President Reagan had wanted to avoid with the operation, and narrowly missed hitting the French embassy. One of the aircraft in the package was targeted by several SA-8s and managed to evade them. The lead aircraft transmitted "Tranquil Tiger," the first comms broadcast since the start of the operation, which indicated he was feet wet again following a successful attack. The 7th aircraft in this element, call sign Karma 52, was slightly behind its timeline, which gave the Libyan SAM operators time to lock the airplane up and fire. The SAM successfully guided and the F-111 exploded. The crew ejected, but the capsule hit the water without the chute opening. The pilot, Captain Fernando Ribas Dominici, and the weapons system officer, Captain Paul Lawrence, were both killed. The crew of Karma 53 saw their wingman get hit, and they aborted their run, not realizing that Muammar Gaddafi was actually at the barracks and barely escaped with his life. Gaddafi's escape was also assisted by the leader of the island of Malta, which was a Libyan enclave at the time, who had heard from the Prime Minister of Italy. Italy had launched some alert F-104s in response to their early warning radar getting contact on this large group of airplanes transiting the Mediterranean to the east and suspected it was American. A few minutes after that, another 6 F-111s approached the Tripoli airfield low from the south, having swung around from the west in an off-axis attack, hopefully catching the SAM operators looking the wrong way. The crews were surprised that the airport remained well lit in spite of the ongoing attack. One of the aardvarks had to abort due to a terrain-following radar malfunction, but the remaining 5 dropped BSU-49 high-drag bombs, which destroyed 4 IL-76 transport aircraft and severely damaged a 5th. 600 miles to the east, America's A-6s damaged the Jamahiriya MiG assembly warehouse and destroyed 4 MiG shipping crates. 2 A-6s from Coral Sea had to abort due to systems failures, but the other 5 used CBU-59 APAM cluster bombs against Benina Airfield, destroying 4 MiGs, 2 Mi-8 helicopters, 1 Fokker F-27 Friendship transport, 1 small straight-wing aircraft, and a Boeing 727. The eastern SAM batteries were less coordinated than those in the west. Unlike the Air Force strikers, the Navy package had only 1 aircraft actually targeted by a SAM, an A-6 from VA-34, but that crew was able to successfully dodge the missile using expendables and maneuvering the aircraft. It's noteworthy that no Libyan fighters launched during the strike, testament to how much they feared the F-14. The entire operation was over in 12 minutes. All of the Navy aircraft were back aboard their carriers by 0253 local. The Air Force airplanes loitered north of the Gulf of Sidr for nearly an hour while trying to clear up confusion about what had happened to Karma 52. One of the F-111s had to divert to Rota, Spain with an engine malfunction during the transit home, but the others made it back to England by 10:10 Libyan time, which made it a 12-hour mission end-to-end. After the dust settled, Gaddafi announced that he had won a spectacular military victory over the United States, and that he was officially renaming the country the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. And on the other side of the Atlantic, President Reagan announced to the nation and the world,
"Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again."
In spite of the systems failures and missed targets and loss of a crew, the U.S. Air Force declared Operation El Dorado Canyon a success and proof of the efficacy of long-range striking power. For its part, the U.S. Navy added the operation as another data point on why America needs aircraft carriers in a dangerous and uncertain world. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. In the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.